corporate soldier, the company dog, salaryman. He wakes up every morning at 7 a.m. sharp with an alarm. It's likely that he was drinking with his coworkers the night before, and so an alarm is necessary. He showers, combs his hair, puts on a uniform. A uniform is also necessary. It is company policy, after all. It's expensive to own a car, and parking is near impossible to find downtown, so he always takes public transportation. In the early 80s, the salaryman did not have a smartphone. He does not even have a cell phone. Of course, the printed book is a technology that has been around for hundreds of years, but it is all the salaryman can do to simply stay awake as he rides the bus or subway. A book might put him to sleep. He might miss his stop and arrive late to work, and for a mistake like that, there would be consequences. To treat boredom, to keep the salaryman awake, to assuage the anxiety he feels about performing well, about impressing his boss, about moving his way slowly up the corporate ladder, there is an antidote. The Game & Watch. A compact, sleek, and elegant device with a metal sheen reminiscent of a calculator or other scientific instrument. A toy, yes, but not one that looks out of place in the pocket of a suit jacket, and something easily hidden if the salaryman happens to find himself in the same car as a nosy coworker or boss. Once the commute ends and the workday begins, the salaryman will be at the office for 8, 9, sometimes 10 hours. After he finally clocks out, his boss will likely pressure him again to go out for drinks, to facilitate a sense of camaraderie within the company. He won't touch the Game & Watch again unless, perhaps out of boredom or sheer desperation, he goes to the toilet and plays a quick round. There's about a 50% chance the salaryman plays his Game & Watch on the bus ride home. Half the time, he naps instead. He arrives home to make some instant ramen, and soon falls asleep to fitful dreams that give no rest. The next morning, his inescapable routine begins once again. So how does the story of the salaryman end? Does he die an early death from stress and overwork? Does he manage to provide for a family in the hopes that his children will have a better life than he? Or perhaps he breaks free from his chains and ends up pursuing a career that actually fulfills him in some meaningful way. I'll leave the details of his fate up to your imagination to decide. What is certain, however, is that our relationship to mobile technology has changed vastly since the early 1980s. The salaryman and his Game & Watch unit could not have imagined the smartphones, tablets, and game consoles we have today that can play hundreds, if not thousands of games at an instant. You might be thinking, well, great, we're much better off than the salaryman was before. But a quick look at some research actually shows, in terms of wages, things have been totally stagnant since then. While productivity has gone up, wages have not risen to actually meet those increased levels of productivity. As you can see in these charts from the Economic Policy Institute, it's quite a dispiriting picture. Workers produce much more, but typical workers' pay lagged far behind. When it comes to annual pay increases, top 1% wage grew 138%, while wages for the bottom 90% grew only 15%. Wages of college graduates have been falling since the year 2000. CEOs now make 296 times what a typical worker earns. The minimum wage would be over $18 had it risen alongside productivity. So it seems that the salaryman, despite only having his Game & Watch to keep him on precipice of benumbed resignation in lieu of an abyss of despair, may have actually been better off economically than workers are today. But why am I bringing this up? Well, if you look at the Game & Watch games themselves, there are about 60 different titles in all, you'll find that the idea of work and the working class person is quite central to the story behind most of these games. While many video games of the time were based in the realm of fantasy or science fiction, exploring dungeons, fighting space invaders, etc., Game & Watch tended to keep its subject matter fully in the realm of the ordinary. Though Mr. Game & Watch is originally just an amalgam of many different characters that appear in the Game & Watch titles, a sort of useful fiction created by Sakurai and his team specifically for Smash Bros., I think the consistency we see in the themes of his games actually make it easier to construct a biography of Mr. Game & Watch as a character, in the same way that we can talk about Samus or Princess Peach as a character. So let's go on a journey to discover Mr. Game & Watch's moveset, and find the hidden tragedies and triumphs behind the life of a two-dimensional man. San Francisco, the early 20th century. To make things simple, let's say Mr. Game & Watch was born in the year 1900. Perhaps like many heroes, Mr. Game & Watch was an orphan, but unlike the orphans of science fiction and fantasy novels, most orphans born in the rough part of town aren't likely to be chosen for some great destiny. We see Mr. Game & Watch's first gig being that of a street performer, a juggler. If you go to the Fisherman's Wharf section of San Francisco today, you'll still find plenty of these street performers trying to make a living from the generosity of tourists. This wasn't a bad gig for a teenager trying to make some money on the side, but it isn't long before Mr. Game & Watch yearns to see sights beyond the city he grew up in. It's off to the docks, where he becomes part of the crew of a sailing vessel, working as a flagman. Being the lowest-ranked crew member of a sailing ship in the early 1900s must have been hard work, not only getting ordered around by the bosun, but getting beat by the broad sun, wind, and rain. After docking on a particularly grueling voyage, it seems Mr. Game & Watch left his seafaring days behind and tried a variety of odd jobs, the first being that of an exterminator. Rabbits, gophers, rats, and other type of vermin were no doubt a nuisance for the many gardens over in the East Bay, in Oakland and Berkeley. So he probably made a fair living using hammers, or, as we see in this example, using dogs and ferrets combined with humane traps to capture the pests. This takes us to 1923, when the Great Berkeley Fire consumes over 600 buildings, including the tenement home where Mr. Game & Watch likely lived. Though initially released as part of the Silver series in 1980, Fire was remade as part of the widescreen series in 1981. This version featured an alarm in addition to the basic clock functionality. The blue and gold colors of this unit serve as the template for Flat Zone X, the home stage of Mr. Game & Watch in Smash Ultimate. Though we act as the paramedics in this game, you'll notice that Mr. Game & Watch himself is the one being rescued here, and his jumping animation matches that of the figures jumping out of the building. If you play the Game Boy Advance version of this game, you'll notice it has been censored insofar as the characters walk away with a bandage symbol when hitting the ground, whereas in the original version of this game, there is an image of an angel, implying that every miss results in a death. It seems Mr. Game & Watch was one of the lucky survivors.
Trains waited for them. Hospital wards on wheels.
With the next game, Judge, we might think that Mr. Game & Watch somehow managed to get both an undergraduate and law degree to become an arbiter of the court. The chances that this was the case, considering that Mr. Game & Watch just lost his livelihood due to a raging fire, are slim to none. A quick look at the game itself is enough to show you that this is not a black-robed official delivering lawful judgment, but rather two brutes whacking each other with a hammer. More likely the game is a reference to the law enforcement side of justice, specifically the police baton.
The police baton is an excellent weapon if properly used by the officer.
It seems obvious to me that Mr. Game & Watch ran into some difficult times, while also having a few run-ins with police, since the only judgment being rendered here is that of a cruel beating for someone who's already down on his luck. We don't know how long Mr. Game & Watch was getting into fights, drifting around, stealing to survive, but eventually it is clear that he is able to pick himself up and take a job as a sewer worker, plugging manholes for unawares citizens walking the streets above. It is a dirty, slimy, filthy job that Mr. Game & Watch leaves as soon as he's saved up enough to get another place of his own. Meanwhile, California is expanding and growing in size rapidly at this time, so there's a big market for construction work. But doing any kind of serious construction in the early 20th century, even with a helmet, is still dangerous. With tools falling and no supervisor in sight, Mr. Game & Watch is putting himself at constant risk of injury. My own father is a mechanic, and I can tell you that he came home every night with grime in his fingernails, burns, bruises, cuts and abrasions on his arms and hands. Every day, manual laborers are putting their bodies on the line to put food on the table for their families, while some fat cat in a suit gets to sit at the top floor of a skyscraper that he never once had to get his hands dirty to build. Meanwhile, workers are every day shaking hands with danger.
That you won't fall. You'll save yourself a minute, but you may damn well lose it all.
We don't know exactly how long Mr. Game & Watch worked in construction, but it is clear that the performer inside that came to life when he worked as a juggler the streets of San Francisco still yearned to be applauded and seen. He ditches his construction job and joins the circus, working as a lion tamer. Perhaps he became an apprentice to Clyde Beatty, one of the most famous lion tamers of the time, who headlined dates at Madison Square Garden between 1931 and 1934. Mr. Game & Watch is also responsible for the upkeep of the monkeys and gorillas, using a key to lock the cages at night, which, as you can see here, looks quite similar to the key Donkey Kong Jr. uses to free his caged father in the Game & Watch title of the same name. It's not long before the humiliation these noble creatures have to endure at the hands of their circus jailers is too much for Mr. Game & Watch to bear. Having been an exploited worker himself, he has no taste for the exploitation of creatures caged against their will for mere spectacle. Good evening and welcome to Part 2 of the Life of Mr. Game & Watch. If you haven't yet seen Part 1, please click the link in the description below to learn more about the fascinating stories behind the first 8 Game & Watch titles. Disillusioned with his work as a circus carny, and finding himself in the midst of the Great Depression, Mr. Game & Watch takes to the seas in the hopes of discovering sunken treasure from ages long past. Originally released as part of the widescreen series in July of 1981, this title finds Mr. Game & Watch diving for gold while evading the clutches of a giant octopus. In Smash Ultimate, we see the diving helmet from this game featured in his up smash, while his final smash finds Mr. Game & Watch actually transforming into the octopus itself in order to grab his opponents and carry them off screen. The diving helmet we see in Octopus is an innovation of the early 20th century, and it allowed humans to explore the depths of the oceans in a more intimate way than ever before.
But the spirit of adventure is unquenched. The crew of Fishing Smack brings news of giant octopus nearby. Can't afford to miss a chance to photograph one of these elephant spiders of the ocean floor. The diver is going to try and locate the octopus and pose him for the camera. The ocean floor is a dream world, silent, vast, mystic, unreal, lonely beyond words. Beauty that haunts one, majesty all its own, inhabited by strange, weird creatures.
After securing some gold for himself and learning a few new fishing techniques from his octopus friend, Mr. Game & Watch decides to pursue a lifelong dream he's had of opening his own restaurant. Now, anyone who's ever worked in food service knows it is neither easy nor glamorous. It is hot, stressful, fast-paced, as evidenced even by the original Game & Watch game, where orders are being cooked non-stop, one after the other, not unlike the experience of being a line cook at a busy restaurant. To make matters worse, a greedy cat and mouse use every opportunity they can to steal some of the food for themselves. When doing battle in Smash Ultimate, Mr. Game & Watch can use his newfound cooking skills to effectively harass his opponents as they attempt to get back on the stage. You'll also notice that the kitchen from Chef is featured as one of the backgrounds on the Flat Zone X stage. This piping hot special attack can also at times light opponents on fire. As anyone who has worked in food service knows, it is quite easy to disappoint customers, and quite difficult to please them, so becoming a chef is certainly not a profession for the faint of heart.
A scalding cauldron for each kind of soup you may pick bill of fare. Thin, clear, thick, with or vegetables, with or without meat. It must satisfy the cook before it satisfies you, and his sense of taste can never tire. Old-fashioned beef stew, cream of mushroom soup, or consommé with a fancy name after it. No one can buy the recipe. The soup cook keeps his guarded secret and passes it on only to his successors.
After a few years of toiling away in the kitchen, Mr. Game & Watch decides to take a vacation. Knowing of his knack for adventure, it should come as no surprise that he decides to book an African safari, where he can enjoy the beauty and thrill of the natural world without the desperate need to find riches that fueled his previous adventures. The most famous American safari man is probably Theodore Roosevelt, 25th President of the United States, who wrote a book about the safari he went on immediately after leaving office in 1910. Besides holding the record for being the youngest man ever to hold office, Teddy Roosevelt also holds the record of most published books by a president at 46 titles. His literary talents are on full display here in his opening to African Game Trails. In these greatest of the world's great hunting grounds, there are mountain peaks whose snows are dazzling under the equatorial sun, swamps where the slime oozes and bubbles and festers in the steaming heat, lakes like seas, skies that burn above deserts where the iron desolation is shrouded from view by the wavering mockery of the mirage, vast grassy plains where palms and thorn trees fringe the dwindling streams, mighty rivers rushing out the heart of the continent through the sadness of endless marshes, forests of gorgeous beauty where death broods in the dark and silent depths. Of course, the issues surrounding colonial conquest of Africa during the late 19th and early 20th centuries are too vast, their consequences too far-reaching and long-lasting to address in this video. Suffice it to say that it is one thing to visit a formerly colonized nation as a Westerner, while it is something else entirely to be part of a nation that has lived through colonial rule and continues to suffer from the consequences of it, even to this day.
With muddy river water. There they go, up and over. We pushed on through the high grass for many miles.
We now arrive at the most contentious move in Mr. Game & Watch's repertoire, his forward smash. As you can see in this earlier version of the attack, Mr. Game & Watch is shown wearing a loincloth with a feather on his head, with a fierce, toothy expression on his face. In the final version of the game, everything has been retained except for the feather. Now, the origin of this move is the game Fire Attack, released in March of 1982. To say this game is in bad taste is an understatement. You play as a military soldier stationed at a wooden frontier fort. The objective of the game is to fight off the Indians that endlessly swarm the fort in an effort to burn it down. Whenever an Indian successfully reaches the fort with his torch, the miss icon shows a grinning native holding up a peace sign. While films and other media much prefer to portray the wars against Native Americans as a conflict between two equal combatants, the reality is that Native Americans were far outmatched by the firearms of European settlers, besides also being ravaged by European diseases, against which they had little to no immunity. What took place over the course of 200 years of European expansion into the Americas amounts to no less than genocide. Although some Native American tribes survived and were corralled into reservations, many tribes and languages were completely eradicated. I actually saw this firsthand when I went on a recent camping trip. During the hike, I came across a stone underneath a large oak tree, with man-made cavities in the stone. Knowing that acorns were commonly ground and turned into mash by California native peoples, I figured this was evidence of Native American habitation of the area. And sure enough, later on I found a brochure mentioning the tribe that lived there and their eventual extinction. It's one thing to read about these events in a book, but entirely another to actually walk through a place where a group of people, with their own unique language, culture, mythology, religion, and art, once lived and breathed, only to see them vanish without a trace other than the indentations in the stones. Throughout the late 1800s, small wars and expeditions were constantly waged against native peoples to force them into reservations, or to kill off those who did not comply. The fort that we see in Fire Attack is a fairly accurate depiction of the frontier forts that were used as bases for troops to garrison during those wars. The backdrop of this game looks like it is based in the American Southwest, which makes sense, considering the largest areas that the United States government apportioned to the surviving tribes, in Oklahoma, the Dakotas, and Arizona, were among the most arid, barren, and uninhabitable parts of the entire country.
Chickasaws, Choctaws, and Seminoles, who were driven from their homes to the east. Oklahoma became the principal Indian territory. Today, it includes remnants of 88 tribes in its 120,000 of Indian ancestry.
So if you know anything about the history of Native Americans and you have felt in your heart even a few moments of empathy for the incredible pain and suffering that they went through, then you'll naturally feel uncomfortable about playing a game where you reenact a historically very real ethnic cleansing. For those who say, "It's just a game, don't take it so seriously," I wonder if they would be comfortable playing a game where you control a Nazi guard at a concentration camp, who has to kill Jews attempting to storm the camp to free their family members. If you think this example is too extreme a comparison, then you clearly haven't internalized just how devastating US expansion and conquest was for the native peoples of this land. Nintendo included a remade version of Fire Attack in Game & Watch Gallery 4, released in 2002 for the Game Boy Advance. As you can see, the feathers have been removed from the attackers along with, seemingly, their loincloths, raising questions as to why a band of naked bald men with torches are trying to burn down your fort. I bring this up to show that in 2002, 16 years before Smash Ultimate was released, the developers at Nintendo who worked on this game were aware of just how much an ethical atrocity the wars against Native Americans were. It is possible, however, that Nintendo of Japan didn't see anything wrong with the game and planned to include the original version, but received pushback from Nintendo of America, who were likely more attuned to the controversy that might arise from it. This seems to be what happened in the case of Smash Ultimate, since it was Nintendo of America that was alerted to the stereotypical caricature and likely immediately had a conference with the folks at Nintendo of Japan, who were responsible for the development and coding of the game. But why did the developers of Smash Ultimate decide to include animations that they had already excluded on the Game Boy Advance in 2002? The most obvious answer is that these were two completely different teams, two different sets of people working on two different games. And like I said earlier, since the majority of United States citizens are probably ignorant of the real history of Native Americans, it wouldn't be surprising if the majority of Japanese citizens also were ignorant of this history. But it is also possible that the developers felt that since they were giving Mr. Game & Watch the role of the Native American with the torch, rather than that of the frontier soldier with the hammer killing them, they were reversing the power balance in a way that may have seemed more respectful. After all, another game that was released around the same time as Smash Ultimate, Red Dead Redemption 2, features Native Americans prominently in the storyline. And while there may be some critiques that one could make about the depiction of Native Americans here, it does seem that the team at Rockstar Games tried their best to be respectful of the culture, while acknowledging the real traumatic history of the time period. It is worth noting that even in a game that gives you the freedom to attack and kill almost every NPC, Rockstar implemented a very deliberate lockdown on your ability to attack NPCs in the Wapiti Indian Reservation. Even in a game with bandit challenges that require you to hog-tie people and throw them on train tracks, Rockstar still decided that they didn't want people to be able to kill Native Americans in their game. This isn't to say that violence against Native Americans is not shown at all in Red Dead Redemption 2. There is a mission where a Native American is captured and tortured at a fort, quite similar to the one in Fire Attack. There are also Native Americans that die in an attack on an oil factory, owned by a man who wants to drill on their reservation land. But the difference here is that you see the story from the perspective of the Native Americans. They are not cartoonish caricatures, but actually feel like real people struggling with real issues. And as the hero, Arthur Morgan, you take their side. Now, I've only played through the game with high honor, so I don't know exactly how the narrative would change if you play with low honor. But it certainly doesn't change so much that you side with the US Army and join in the slaughter of natives. You could say that Rockstar wanted their game to be on the right side of history, similar to how the makers of Wolfenstein have you fighting against Nazis rather than playing as a Nazi. Now here's the thing, as a creative writer myself, I am always defensive of the right of people to create whatever they want, even if it is controversial or may offend others. But to say that Fire Attack is creative in any meaningful sense is laughable. All it does is reuse stereotypical imagery from spaghetti western films. It doesn't say anything interesting. It doesn't offer gameplay that you couldn't find in another Game & Watch title. It doesn't tell an interesting story or make you think. All it does is perpetuate the idea of the Native American as a marauding savage. Now here's the thing, I do believe fundamentally people should be allowed to engage in whatever fantasy they want in their own private life. If you just love collecting retro games and you want a complete Game & Watch collection, I have nothing against you owning Fire Attack and playing it every once in a while. Whatever you want to do in your own time, in the privacy of your own home, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, should be your business and no one else's. But as a community, as a culture, we are constantly deciding what to pass on to the next generation and what to discard into the dustbin of history. We know all too well that our young people learn more from the media they consume than they do from the textbooks they may or may not be reading at school. And we all agree that there are things that should be left behind forever, such as slavery. Or, in the United States, we've decided that we want to leave behind the institution of the monarchy, even though some other cultures are holding on to it. That's fine, different cultures can hold on to different things, but at some point we want to have a conversation about what we'd like to keep and what we'd like to discard. If a group of people have been nearly exterminated from the face of the earth, had their culture, their land, their language stolen from them, and their only request now is that we respect their cultural identity and stop profiting from their heritage, is that really too much to ask? It's a matter of empathy, plain and simple. You either have it or you don't. If you are really so concerned and angered about Nintendo removing 2 frames of animation out of respect for someone else's culture, then I envy you for having so little in this world to get angry about that this is the only thing that you're triggered by. Personally, I think Nintendo took the easy way out by simply issuing an apology and removing the feather. Of course, this makes sense since feathers and headdresses are not just casual wear for many native tribes. They are sacred symbols only given on ritual occasions, to signify a rite of passage or to bestow a great honor. But the game retains the same toothy grin, the loincloth, and the reference to the original cringeworthy game. Nintendo could have actually done something constructive based on the fact that they made a profit from Fire Attack, by, say, creating an annual scholarship for Native American students to attend school for computer science, art, or game design. A scholarship like that would be a drop in the bucket for Nintendo, but it would make a huge difference in the lives of at least a few Native people and families. And it would show that the company is actually listening and doing something for the community. By removing the feather and leaving it at that, Nintendo is erasing their own history, while at the same time removing the only Native American character in any first-party Nintendo game without actually doing anything constructive to help the Native American community, who still suffer from some of the highest rates of disease and poverty in the country. Instead of getting annoyed that Nintendo decided to remove this outdated caricature of a cartoonish Indian, perhaps we should be more annoyed about the fact that Nintendo has never put an authentic or interesting Native American character in any of their first-party games. I think even if it's in a superficial way, most people around the world think Native Americans are pretty cool, and they would love a chance to get to know more about their culture through an interesting character. We'll see if Nintendo ever decides to go in this direction, but in the meantime, I think we're fine with leaving Fire Attack behind, in the dustbin of history. Returning to our biography of Mr. Game & Watch, it is not out of the question to think that, after returning from his African safari and letting his restaurant manage itself, he might try some other hobbies, including acting. It was not uncommon to have non-native actors put on makeup and get cast as Native Americans in the early days of cinema, so it is conceivable that Mr. Game & Watch took on a role as an extra in a film like the one depicted in Fire Attack. That would also help explain our timeline, since otherwise we'd have to go back to the late 1800s to find a scene like the one we saw in that game. Having just finished a rather long digression, I will not discuss the politics behind Redface, but suffice it to say that there is a reason why Rockstar, for example, decided to cast native actors for their native roles. The next game in our chronology could very well have taken place during the Second World War, when the entire country mobilized in order to fund the war effort. Victory gardens were vegetable, fruit, and herb gardens planted at private residences and public parks in the United States during World War I and World War II. In wartime, governments encouraged people to plant victory gardens not only to supplement their rations, but also to boost morale. They were used along with rationing stamps and cards to reduce pressure on the public food supply. This made victory gardens a part of daily life on the home front. Seeing as by this time Mr. Game & Watch would have been too old to join the military, he may have volunteered at a greenhouse, fumigating bugs that might otherwise damage the crops. Of course, we know a little bit more now about the health hazards of spraying the food we eat with pesticides, but back then, scientists assured folks that pesticides on our foods and asbestos in our homes were A-OK. After the Second World War, America experienced an economic boom that brought the automobile to the forefront of American life. After years of rationing and uncertainty during the war, Americans were ready to spend their hard-earned money on purchasing homes in the suburbs, along with new cars to park in the garages of those homes. Car sales quadrupled between 1945 and 1955, and by the end of the 1950s, some 75% of American households owned at least one car. Since it is quite possible that Mr. Game & Watch's restaurant had to close down during the war, putting some of his capital into purchasing a full-service gasoline and repair station is not too far outside the realm of possibility. It's no surprise that tossing oil at his enemies is such a powerful move in Smash Ultimate, since any mechanic knows how dangerous hot oil can be. Along with the post-war economic boom came a population boom and the origin of the word boomer, to describe people born in this time period. After finally experiencing some stability for the first time in his life, Mr. Game & Watch decides to settle down and start a family. We don't see much of the younger Game & Watch until Spitball Sparky, a bit of an odd game in the short-lived Supercolor series. If this commercial is any indication, this game is intended to appeal to the kind of snotty child who might shoot spitballs at other students in class.
I used to hate taking long trips with my parents. Nothing to look at but the backs of their heads and the side of the road. But then I got this Spitball Sparky game. It's got great color, and it's challenging to play. It's small enough to go to all those boring places your parents want to go.
Spitball Sparky, the onboard game by Nintendo.
This game may also be the origin of several of Mr. Game & Watch's alternate colors. Though the Smash Wiki page says that the second color is a reference to the Virtual Boy, the bright, fire truck red colors of those games don't really match this darker shade of maroon red, which much more closely resembles the shade featured on the back of the original Ball unit. While this particular shade of green is definitely a reference to the original colors of the Nintendo Game Boy, the handheld that essentially succeeded and replaced the Game & Watch. With that, we move into 1985's Tropical Fish, where we perhaps get to see a glimpse at a more detailed depiction of Mr. Game & Watch. A man, worn out from years of hard labor, now in his middle age and grown a little stocky, taking care of a sunroom in his medium-sized suburban home, with a wife and kids somewhere out in the backyard. And what better example of a middle-class hobby than maintaining an aquarium and doing your best to keep the fish happy as they hop from one tank to the other. This may have been a fitting end for the biography of Mr. Game & Watch, gainfully employed as a mechanic, providing for his family with enough extra income for some hobbies and pets. However, the story of the life of Mr. Game & Watch was destined to end somewhat more tragically.
These are the real victims of war. The farmer, the fisherman. For them, the war is a nightmare that never ends. And the faces of the people reflect this suffering.
Almost all wars involve humans inflicting unfathomable levels of agony and pain on others. It is the great shame of our species, because most human societies throughout history have waged war with frightening regularity. The depths of cruelty that humans are capable of isn't an easy thing to reckon with, especially if you are an empathetic person by nature. Distance makes things easier, of course. Those in power, those who know they will never have to set foot in a foreign jungle or desert to kill and possibly be killed, will not hesitate to let others die and suffer, if it means they will remain in power as a result. It's a sorry state of affairs, but it's the world we live in. So long as humans continue to wage war, other humans will make films, novels, songs, and video games about war as well. In June of 1981, Nintendo released Parachute, the first title in their new widescreen series of Game & Watch units. We see this move represented in Smash Ultimate by his Up Special, where he glides down with a parachute after launching into the air. While parachutes themselves were used as early as World War I, the helicopter seen in this game, probably modeled after the Boeing CH-47, did not exist prior to the Vietnam War. The tropical environment, with islands and palm trees, also gives us cause to believe that the setting for the game is Vietnam. Seeing as Mr. Game & Watch would be in his 50s or 60s by the time of the Vietnam War, it is highly unlikely that he would have been on active military duty. The only conclusion we can make, without distorting our timeline, is that this game depicts Mr. Game & Watch's son, who either enlisted or was drafted into the US Army. Though most wars involve senseless bloodshed, any student of history knows that the Vietnam War was particularly senseless, a wasteful loss of resources and life that went on for far longer than it should have. Many Americans and Vietnamese died for no good reason, especially considering that those in command knew how hopeless their chances of victory were. Yet in their pridefulness they pressed on, for no other reason than that the United States had never lost a war of this kind before. It is well within the realm of possibility, then, that Mr. Game & Watch's son died in this war, which might help explain the final game that appears as part of Mr. Game & Watch's moveset, Safebuster. Released in June of 1988, this was one of the last Game & Watch titles ever made. We can't help but ask, what could have made a successful business and family man turn to a life of crime? Perhaps, like many other victims of war, Mr. Game & Watch never recovered from the psychological damage wrought by losing his eldest son. Perhaps in his grief he was no longer able to keep up his commitments at the service station, and thus let his family fall into poverty. Being a self-made man, rising up from poverty, there was no safety net or family that could have helped Mr. Game & Watch through this difficult time. There is something both tragic and beautiful about imagining Mr. Game & Watch doing what he could to provide for his other children in the aftermath of this terrible war. This tragic beauty, I think, is captured well in the song Bank Robber by the English punk band The Clash. Sadly, the great Joe Strummer, who wrote the lyrics to this song, passed away in 2002. The legacy of The Clash and other musicians and artists who write stories and songs about working-class people lives on. The man who steals to survive is not a criminal, but rather a victim of a corrupt system that functions to keep the existing social order and hierarchy in place. There are more artists today who are vocal in their support of the downtrodden and vulnerable than ever before, and they continue to use their voices in support of collective movements. The life of Mr. Game & Watch, seen through the lens of a working-class hero, can be an inspiration for the next generation of gamers, who might find in the roots of this character an homage to a time in American life that was harsher, more rugged, more cruel, and which built the foundations of the prosperity we enjoy today. The kind of prosperity that allows for a console like the Switch to be within the means of many families' budgets. But, like I mentioned in part 1 of this video, the real wages of working-class people has not risen in accordance with the rise in GDP. A factory worker in the 1950s could have supported a family of 4, but these days you would be immensely lucky to find any working-class job that could pay for a mortgage and support an entire family. Therefore, it is up to us, the next generation, to use our vote to support the working people that make this country function, to increase the minimum wage, demand universal health care, and stop allowing CEOs of big corporations to profit from our sweat, our labor, and our bodies. I thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of a great American working-class hero. Until next time, remember that those who do not move do not notice their chains. The longer the picket line, the shorter the strike. a fair day's work deserves a fair day's wage, and an injury to one is the concern of all. With that, I wish you good night and good luck.
Never give up!